What you're about to witness is not just a story about food. It's about the moment when enemies became saviors, when pride shattered against the weight of starvation, and when a simple bowl of stew carried more power than any weapon ever could. This is the story of how British soldiers, walking through the ruins of their former enemy's homeland, did something that no one expected. Something that would break the hearts of mothers who had learned to survive on nothing but hope and ash. Before we dive into this profound journey, let me know in the comments where you're watching from and if you've ever heard a story about your own family from the war years. Now, settle in, because what happened in those first weeks after the war ended in the Pacific will challenge everything you thought you knew about human nature, forgiveness, and the incredible resilience of the human spirit. The year was 1945. Japan had surrendered. The mushroom clouds over Hiroshima and Nagasaki had dissipated into the atmosphere, but their shadows remained burned into the earth and into the souls of an entire nation. Cities that once thrived with life now stood as skeletal remains: Tokyo, Osaka, Yokohama, reduced to endless fields of rubble, twisted metal, and the acrid smell of destruction that clung to everything like a second skin. In the midst of this apocalyptic landscape, there existed a group of people who had become invisible even to themselves: the mothers of Japan. These women who had once run households with precision and grace, who had raised children with the ancient values of honor, discipline, and respect, now found themselves in a hell they could never have imagined. Their husbands were dead, missing, or so broken by defeat that they had become hollow shells. Their homes were gone, their country had been crushed, and their children, oh their children, were starving. Let me paint you a picture of what starvation actually looks like, because it's not what you see in movies. It's not dramatic. It's slow, grinding, and utterly dehumanizing. These mothers would wake before dawn, when the air was still thick with the previous night's cold, and they would search. They searched through rubble for anything: a handful of rice grains scattered among the debris, tree bark that could be boiled into a bitter soup, roots dug from the earth with bare, bleeding hands, even insects and grass. Anything that could be placed in a child's mouth to silence the crying, to stop the terrible hollow look in their eyes, just for one more day. The mothers themselves? They ate almost nothing. They would watch their children consume whatever meager scraps they had found, and they would smile, telling them they had already eaten, that they weren't hungry. But their bodies told a different story: sunken cheeks, skin stretched tight over bone, eyes that had lost their light. They were dying in slow motion, sacrificing themselves one missed meal at a time, because that's what mothers do. That's what love looks like when the world has been stripped down to its rawest form. And then, in the early autumn of 1945, something unprecedented began to happen. British forces, part of the Allied occupation, started arriving in various regions of Japan. Now, you have to understand the complexity of this moment. These were the same British whose colonies Japan had invaded, whose soldiers Japan had captured and brutalized in camps like Changi and along the Burma Railway, whose empire had been challenged and humiliated in Singapore and Burma. The Japanese people had been taught for years that these Westerners were demons, barbarians, the enemy in the most absolute sense. The propaganda had been relentless. Posters showing monstrous Western soldiers, radio broadcasts warning of the atrocities that would surely come with occupation, stories whispered in the dark about what happened to women and children when the enemy arrived. So when those first British trucks rolled through the devastated streets, the mothers didn't see liberators. They saw terror. They gathered their children close, pulled them into the shadows of bombed-out buildings, and watched with hearts pounding in their chests, waiting for the violence they had been promised would come. But here's where our story truly begins. Because what happened next defied every expectation, every cultural barrier, every wound of war. The British soldiers who arrived were not the demons of propaganda. They were young men, many barely out of their teens, who had themselves seen the horrors of war, who had lost friends, who carried their own scars, who were tired of death. And when they looked at the Japanese civilians, particularly the women and children, they didn't see the enemy. They saw human beings in desperate need. The British command had established relief stations, places where food could be distributed to the civilian population. But there was a problem, a deeply human problem rooted in culture, trauma, and pride. The Japanese mothers wouldn't come. They would stand at a distance, sometimes for hours, watching as the soldiers set up tables with large pots of stew, with bread, with supplies that seemed like impossible luxury. But they wouldn't approach. Some were afraid, genuinely terrified that this was a trap, that approaching would result in punishment or worse. Others were constrained by shame, by the cultural weight of having lost the war, by the deeply ingrained sense that accepting help from the enemy was a betrayal of everything they had been taught to believe. And still others were held back by pride. Not arrogance, but that fierce, protective pride that says, I will not beg. I will not be seen as weak, even as my body crumbles and my children cry from hunger. One soldier, a young British corporal named James Whitfield, noticed this pattern. James was from a small village in Yorkshire, the son of a coal miner, a man who had known hardship in his own way. He had landed in Burma in 1944, had fought through jungles and seen friends die in ways that still haunted his sleep. But James had also been raised by a mother who had taught him something fundamental. That kindness was not weakness, that compassion was the truest form of strength, especially when it was hardest to give. He watched these Japanese mothers hovering in the distance, and something in his chest tightened. He could see it in their eyes, the hunger, the fear, the desperate calculation of whether survival was worth the cost to their dignity. And he decided he wasn't going to wait for them to come to him. One particular afternoon, as the autumn sun cast long shadows through the ruins, James noticed a woman standing apart from even the other hesitant civilians. She was perhaps in her early 30s, though hardship had aged her in ways that made such assessments difficult. She wore a kimono that had once been beautiful but was now patched and stained, held together with improvised repairs. Beside her stood 2 children, a girl of maybe 7 and a boy who couldn't have been more than 4. They clung to their mother's legs, their eyes enormous in their thin faces, watching the steam rise from the pots of food with an intensity that was painful to witness. The mother's face was a mask of controlled emotion, her jaw set, her eyes fixed on the food, but her feet refusing to move forward. James could see her hands trembling at her sides, see the way her breath came in short, controlled bursts as she fought an internal war between need and pride. James ladled a generous portion of stew into a bowl, a thick, hearty mixture of meat, vegetables, and broth that the British field kitchens had prepared. He also took 2 pieces of bread and a small cup of milk. Then, without fanfare, without making a show of it, he simply walked over to where the woman stood. He didn't approach quickly or aggressively. He moved slowly, carefully, his body, language deliberately non-threatening. When he reached her, he held out the bowl and the bread. For a moment, the world seemed to stop. The woman's eyes went wide, her entire body going rigid. She looked at the food, then at James's face, then back at the food. Her lips began to tremble. Her hands, which had been clenched at her sides, slowly, hesitantly rose. When her fingers touched the warm bowl, something broke inside her. You could see it happen, the way a dam cracks before it gives way. Her hands began to shake violently, the bowl nearly spilling, and James quickly steadied it, placing his hands under hers for just a moment until she had a firm grip. What happened next is something that James would remember for the rest of his life. Something he would tell his own children and grandchildren decades later with tears in his eyes. The woman brought the bowl to her lips and took a sip of the broth. Just a sip? And then her face crumpled completely. Tears began streaming down her cheeks, not delicate tears but great, racking sobs that shook her entire body. She tried to hold them back. You could see her fighting it, her free hand coming up to cover her mouth. But it was useless. The tears came anyway, and they wouldn't stop. Her children stared up at her in alarm, not understanding. And she quickly knelt down, breaking off pieces of the bread and placing them in their hands, and then giving them the bowl to share. As they ate, and oh, the way they ate, desperately, with the single-minded focus that only truly hungry children have. The mother watched them with an expression of such profound relief and such profound anguish that it was almost unbearable to witness. She had a small amount of the stew herself, and with each spoonful, more tears came. Because this wasn't just food. This was the first real meal she had eaten since before the war had turned catastrophic, since before the firebombing campaigns, since before her world had been reduced to ruins and radiation and relentless, gnawing hunger. But here's what you need to understand about that moment, about what that simple bowl of stew represented. For this mother, it wasn't just about the physical sustenance, though God knows that was desperately needed. It was about what the giving of it meant. She had been taught that the British were monsters. She had been told that defeat would bring humiliation and suffering at the hands of the victors. She had believed, because she had no reason not to, believed that compassion from the enemy was impossible. And yet here was this young soldier, this man whose nation her nation had attacked, whose brothers in arms had died at Japanese hands, and he was feeding her children, not with contempt, not with superiority, but with simple, genuine human kindness. In that moment, something fundamental shifted in her understanding of the world. The rigid categories of friend and enemy, of us and them, began to crack. She looked up at James, really looked at him, and in broken, hesitant English learned from before the war, she whispered 2 words, "Thank you." And then, in Japanese, something more, a phrase that roughly translates to, "You have restored my faith." James, who didn't speak Japanese, nonetheless understood. He simply nodded, placed a gentle hand on the little girl's head for just a moment, and then walked back to the food station. But this wasn't an isolated incident. Word spread among the mothers, quietly, carefully, because trust was still a fragile thing. More women began to approach, first in ones and twos, then in small groups. Each carried the same burden of fear and pride, and each experienced their own moment of breaking when they tasted food that they hadn't had to scavenge from ruins. That was given freely, that came with no strings attached and no cruelty. The British soldiers witnessed these reactions day after day. The trembling hands, the tears, the way these proud, dignified women would nearly collapse with relief and emotion. Some of the soldiers found it overwhelming. They had been prepared for hostility, for resentment, perhaps for passive acceptance. They had not been prepared for this raw, vulnerable gratitude. Many of them wrote letters home trying to describe it, trying to explain the weight of what they were witnessing. But words seemed inadequate to capture the profound humanity of these encounters. Among the Japanese mothers, there began a quiet transformation. They started to see these British soldiers not as conquerors but as something else, as men who had chosen mercy over vengeance, compassion over cruelty. They saw soldiers who played with their children, making them laugh for the first time in months. They saw men who learned basic Japanese phrases to communicate better, who treated them with respect and dignity. They saw, in short, the possibility of a different future, and this realization was both beautiful and painful because it meant confronting the propaganda they had believed, the hatred they had been taught to feel, and accepting that they had been wrong about the essential nature of their former enemies. Some mothers struggled with this. The cognitive dissonance was intense. How do you reconcile being fed by the same nation whose bombs destroyed your city? How do you accept kindness from those you were taught to hate? But hunger and kindness have a way of cutting through ideology. The human connections being formed in these moments of shared food and vulnerability were more powerful than any political doctrine. Now, let me tell you about what happened to that first mother, the one who James approached. Her name was Keiko Tanaka, and her story would become emblematic of this strange, transformative period. In the weeks that followed that first encounter, Keiko became a bridge between the British relief workers and the Japanese community. She began to encourage other mothers to approach, to accept help. She would stand at the relief station, not working there because the cultural barriers were still too complex for that, but simply being present, a familiar face that made the foreign soldiers less frightening. James and Keiko developed a unique friendship built on limited language but profound mutual respect. He learned her story, how her husband had died in the Philippines, how she had survived the firebombing of Tokyo with her children by hiding in a canal, how she had walked for days to reach a less devastated area. She learned his story, about his village in Yorkshire, about his mother who reminded him to stay human even in war, about the nightmares he still had from Burma. They were, in many ways, an impossible friendship, born from the worst circumstances humanity could create, yet representing the best of what humans could become. The British relief efforts continued for months, and gradually the relationship between the occupying forces and the civilian population evolved. It wasn't perfect. There were incidents, misunderstandings, cultural clashes, but the foundation had been laid by those early acts of kindness, by soldiers who chose to feed rather than punish, and by mothers who chose to accept help rather than die with their pride intact. The stew, the bread, the milk, these simple things became symbols of a radical idea, that the end of war didn't have to mean the continuation of hatred, that victory could be tempered with mercy, that even former enemies could recognize each other's humanity. Years later, when historians would analyze the post-war occupation of Japan, they would focus on MacArthur's reforms, on constitutional changes, on the political restructuring. But they would often miss this quieter story. The story of hungry mothers and compassionate soldiers, of tears shed over bowls of stew, of small acts of kindness that rebuilt trust one meal at a time. Keiko Tanaka survived. Her children survived. They would grow up in the new Japan, the one rebuilt from rubble, and they would carry with them the memory of that autumn afternoon when a British soldier fed them when no one else could. Keiko would tell the story often in her later years, not with bitterness about the war, but with a kind of wonder about the unexpected grace she had received. She would say that the stew tasted like more than food. It tasted like the possibility of forgiveness, like the promise that the world could be rebuilt not just with concrete and steel, but with human decency. James Whitfield returned to Yorkshire after his service ended. He married, had children, worked in the family's small shop, but he kept a photograph in his wallet until the day he died. A photograph taken by a fellow soldier of him at the relief station, with Japanese mothers and children lined up, and in the corner, just barely visible, a woman in a patched kimono with her 2 children, holding a bowl, her face caught in that eternal moment between tears and hope. Here's the truth that this story illuminates, the universal message that transcends the specific circumstances of post-war Japan. Mercy is not weakness. Compassion is not naivety. When we extend kindness to those who have been cast as our enemies, we don't diminish ourselves. We elevate our own humanity. Those British soldiers could have been cruel. They had every historical precedent, every justification from the brutality they had endured, every excuse to treat the defeated Japanese population with contempt or indifference. But they chose differently. They chose to see suffering and respond with care. They chose to feed the hungry even when those hungry had been their enemies. And in doing so, they demonstrated a form of victory far more profound than any military conquest, the victory of human compassion over the cycles of violence and retribution that have plagued our species since the beginning of time. For the Japanese mothers, accepting that help required its own form of courage. It required setting aside pride, confronting shame, questioning everything they had been taught. It required vulnerability in a moment when being vulnerable felt dangerous. But in their acceptance, they took the first steps toward healing. Not just their bodies, but their souls, their communities, their nation. This story teaches us that the most powerful transformations happen in the smallest moments, in a bowl of stew extended from one hand to another, in tears that acknowledge both suffering and grace, in the willingness to be human with each other even when everything in our circumstances tells us to remain enemies. It teaches us that what we do after conflict matters as much as how we conduct ourselves during it. It teaches us that feeding your enemy's children is not betraying your fallen comrades. It's honoring them by building a world where fewer children will go hungry, where fewer mothers will have to make impossible choices, where the cycle of violence can finally be broken. The true nature of strength is revealed not in domination but in restraint, not in revenge but in restoration, not in the ability to destroy but in the choice to rebuild. And faith in humanity, real, tested, hard-won faith, is restored not through grand gestures or political speeches, but through the accumulation of small kindnesses, through the daily choice to treat each other with dignity, through the radical act of feeding someone who has no claim on your compassion except their common humanity. So let me ask you this. In your own life, in your own conflicts, whether they're political, personal, or anything in between, do you have the courage to extend the bowl? Do you have the strength to accept it? Can you look past the labels of enemy and friend, winner and loser, us and them, and simply see another human being who is hungry, who is hurting, who needs what you have to give? That's the challenge this story presents to each of us, because the world is still full of artificial divisions, still full of people going hungry while others have plenty, still full of opportunities to choose cruelty or kindness, vengeance or mercy. And every day, in ways large and small, we're all standing at that relief station. We're all deciding whether to walk across the distance that separates us from someone who is different, someone who we've been taught to see as other, and offer what we have. We're all choosing whether to accept help from unlikely sources, whether to let our pride keep us isolated or our vulnerability connect us to others. The mothers of post-war Japan trembled when they tasted food from British soldiers, not just because they were hungry, but because that food represented something they thought had been destroyed forever. The possibility of grace, the reality of compassion, the evidence that even in our darkest hours, even when we've given each other every reason to remain enemies, we can still choose to be human together. That trembling was the weight of revelation, the physical manifestation of a worldview cracking open to admit a truth that had seemed impossible, that the hand extended in kindness has the power to heal wounds that weapons created. And that's not just a story about 1945. That's a story about right now. That's a story about the world we're building with every choice we make about how to treat each other. So what will you choose? How will you extend mercy today? How will you accept it? How will you be part of breaking the cycles that keep us trapped in endless versions of the same conflicts? If this story moved you, if it changed something in how you see the world, I need you to do something for me. Hit that like button, not just for the algorithm, but as a commitment to carry this message forward. Drop a comment telling me about a time when you extended kindness to someone unexpected, or when someone's mercy changed your life. Share this video with someone who needs to be reminded that compassion is powerful, that mercy is strength, that we're all capable of both tremendous cruelty and tremendous grace, and the choice is ours to make. And subscribe to this channel because we're committed to bringing you more stories like this. Stories that remind us of who we can be at our best. Stories that challenge us to rise above our worst impulses. Stories that prove again and again that love and mercy will always be more powerful than hate and vengeance. The mothers of Japan trembled because they tasted something sacred. Let's build a world where no one has to tremble from hunger, where no one has to fear the stranger's hand, where the bowl of stew is always extended and always accepted in the spirit it's given. That's the world James Whitfield and Keiko Tanaka glimpsed in that autumn moment amid the ruins. Let's make it real.